The Persian Empire of Xerxes was an expanse of stone, gold, and obedience that stretched from the banks of the Indus to the mountains of Greece. In his palaces of Persepolis and Susa, the sun reflected off columns covered in inscriptions, proclaiming the greatness of a man who called himself the King of Kings. In the eyes of the world, Xerxes was the chosen of the gods, the guardian of cosmic order, the mediator between heaven and earth. But the higher his throne rose, the deeper the shadow that surrounded it became. Beneath ceilings painted with lapis lazuli and gold, where the air smelled of incense and myrrh, there existed a space where time did not follow human rules, the royal harem. Officially, it was a symbol of the empire's magnificence, a living demonstration of the reach of his power, as each woman came from a conquered province or a subjugated noble house. But in reality, it was a machinery of silence and control, a world within a world, where luxury served as a disguise for confinement. In the labyrinthine corridors of the harem, the architecture itself seemed designed to confuse. Doors opened only with permission, curtains hid more than they revealed, and the walls absorbed whispers that were never meant to reach the outside. There, the fragrance of flowers and oils mixed its sweetness with something intangible: fear. Because in that place, every look, every gesture, every breath had a price. Xerxes, the man who commanded armies and dictated the destiny of entire peoples, also controlled the rhythms of that feminine microcosm. He was not just a king, he was an entire system embodied in one body, a will that decided who should live in the light and who would remain forever in the shadows. And just as the empire expanded outward, the harem represented his expansion inward, the dominion over the intimate, over what was meant to remain secret. The chroniclers of his time wrote with caution, leaving between the lines the evidence of something that not even the boldest dared to name. Greek, Persian, and Babylonian texts speak of a sovereign whose appetite for power exceeded the limits of comprehension. However, beyond morbid curiosity or condemnation, his story reveals something much more universal. How absolute power, when it meets no resistance or morality, can transform into a ritual of self-destruction. The harem was not merely a precinct of pleasure, but a political institution. Through it, Xerxes consolidated alliances, rewarded loyalties, and kept the most influential families of the empire under surveillance. The women there were not simple companions, but pieces on an imperial chessboard. Each had a title, a function, a rank. Beauty was only the first key, obedience, the second, silence, the ultimate one. In that closed universe, human emotions became strategies. Tenderness became a weapon, envy, survival, and devotion, a form of protection. The women learned to read the king's gestures as if they were sacred texts, to anticipate his will before he even spoke it. Life depended on that silent reading, on knowing when to speak, and above all, when to remain silent. Sometimes the servants who crossed those galleries claimed to feel a dense atmosphere, as if the walls were breathing. The oil lamps cast shadows that danced across the mosaics, figures that seemed to tell a forbidden story, that of desire turned into law, of power feeding on its own echo. However, the true mystery of Xerxes' reign lies not only in what he did, but in what he allowed to exist around him. Because no empire of silence is sustained without accomplices, without eyes that choose not to see. Fear, comfort, blind faith in the monarch's divinity, all of this built the most perfect cage, one where no one believed they were a prisoner. When history attempts to peer into those closed rooms, it does so with caution, almost asking for forgiveness. Ancient sources contradict each other, versions vary, but they all agree on the same tone, one of astonishment mixed with horror. And perhaps in that scattered echo of centuries, what disturbs us most is not the act itself, but the logic that made it possible. The idea that a single man could appropriate not only lands and armies, but also the souls and bodies under his dominion. The incense kept burning, the music kept playing, and the king kept smiling before the frescoes that depicted him as the guardian of cosmic order. But deep within the palace, beneath a layer of gold, a rot was germinating that no sculptor dared to carve. That is the paradox of splendor. It shines so brightly that no one wants to look at the shadow it casts. Xerxes' harem was not an improvised place or an exotic fantasy. It was a carefully organized institution, a structure that combined politics, religion, and social control. At the apex, like a sun dictating the orbit of the planets, was the king himself. Around him revolved the circles of feminine power, the official wives, the high-ranking concubines, the maidens in training, and the servants. Each level had its hierarchy, its etiquette, its language. And at the bottom of the system, invisible and voiceless, was the mass of women destined to serve in silence. The eunuchs were the guardians of that universe, men deprived of inheritance and desire, turned into perfect instruments of surveillance. Nothing escaped their gaze, not a word, not a gesture. They controlled the keys, the lists, the schedules, and the rituals. They were the administrators of a world where time was paced like a liturgy, waking to the sound of flutes, bathing in perfumed oils, attending lessons in music, dance, or courtly conversation, and waiting. Waiting for the call. The architecture of the harem reinforced that idea of absolute control. The rooms were connected by narrow corridors that led into inner courtyards where the sun barely touched the ground. Fountains sang, caged birds repeated soft melodies, and yet none of that broke the feeling of enclosure. The walls decorated with flowers and geometries hid the greatest absence, that of the horizon. From no window could the outside world be seen. It was a garden with no exit, a beauty that served to disguise the prison. Every woman who entered there went through a process of transformation. She lost her original name and received another, assigned according to her origin or her function. She was taught manners, posture, how to smile. She learned to move as if walking on water. Individuality slowly dissolved until only a polished reflection remained, one more piece of the mosaic representing the king's greatness. Her body, her time, and her voice no longer belonged to her. The presentation ceremonies before the monarch were acts of sacred theater. Behind the sensual appearance hid a complex political choreography. Every gesture was calculated to demonstrate absolute obedience to the central power. It was not just about pleasing, it was about confirming the structure of the universe, with the king at the center and everyone else orbiting around him. Sometimes a smile or a word out of place could trigger a punishment, or something worse, oblivion. In Xerxes' court, to be forgotten was to die without leaving a trace. Greek chroniclers, fascinated and horrified at the same time, described the harem as a city within the palace. Indeed, it functioned as a small state with its own laws, hierarchies, bureaucracy, and intrigues. Marriages, pacts, and appointments were decided there. Female alliances had incalculable value, and behind every kind gesture hid a silent war. Some women managed to obtain real power, advising the king or influencing political decisions. Others were relegated to the shadows, forgotten among the curtains and perfumes. Daily rituals marked the passage of time like an inverted hourglass. Aromatic oils brought from India, fabrics dyed with Tyrian purple, lapis lazuli, and gold jewelry from Egypt. Everything combined to create an atmosphere where splendor served to cover up the absence of freedom. The women were treated as works of art, but not as people. Every object, every gesture, every smile had a purpose. To exalt the divine image of the sovereign, the official religion helped sustain this structure. According to royal ideology, Xerxes was the representative of Ahura Mazda on earth, the mediator between gods and men. Therefore, any act of his within the harem could be interpreted not as a human whim, but as a manifestation of divine will. Morality dissolved into theology, and what was unthinkable for others became unquestionable for him. Thus, a system was built where spiritual power and political power fed each other, shielding the monarch's figure from any criticism. Within those walls, luxury and loneliness intertwined. The women lived surrounded by beauty, but also by rumors. They knew that every look could be interpreted, every word repeated, every gesture judged. And while perfumes floated in the air, so did tension. The harem was a musical score that had to be played without error, a symphony of silences and calculated smiles. Sometimes foreign travelers or ambassadors who heard of the harem imagined it as a paradise. They did not understand that this paradise had its doors locked from the inside, because Xerxes' true power lay not in his armies, but in his ability to turn obedience into desire, to mold thoughts until submission seemed natural. That was the most dangerous magic, making captivity be confused with devotion. Amidst the shadows of the harem, where perfumes hid the passage of time, the king's children were also born. The boys were soon separated, sent to receive military or political instruction, educated to govern or die for the empire. But the daughters, those girls who opened their eyes for the first time within the walls of luxury and confinement, grew up breathing the dense air of mystery and control. They were princesses without a destiny, flowers blooming in a sunless garden. Their birth was not celebrated with parades or proclamations, barely a note in the internal records, a new name, a new shadow. From a young age, they learned that discretion was their only protection. They watched their mothers dress in silk garments, listened to the footsteps of the eunuchs, felt the murmur of intrigues floating through the corridors. Childhood in the harem had no laughter, only echoes. While the boys outside learned to ride horses and read sacred texts, they learned to move without making a sound, to look without being seen, to smile when protocol demanded it. Their education was a paradox. They received lessons in music, poetry, and dance. But they did not learn to choose. They were molded to obey, to represent the beauty and order of the empire, not to think for themselves. Sometimes an elderly maiden would tell them stories of freedom, of markets full of voices and paths where one could run without being watched. Those tales sounded like impossible legends, like someone else's dreams. For those girls, the outside world was a fiction that only existed in the words of their elders. The true reality was the cold marble, the sound of measured footsteps, and the echo of distant music. Over time, some of them understood that their destiny would not be to marry a foreign prince or govern a province. They were not destined to become symbols of alliances or mothers of legitimate heirs. Their place was ambiguous, suspended between nobility and servitude. They were of royal blood, but not of political legitimacy. That ambiguity was their condemnation and their prison. When they reached adolescence, their faces began to reflect the beauty they inherited from their mothers and the intense gaze of their father. And then the silence of the harem grew thicker. The boundary between innocence and power blurred. At that point, the young women began to understand that their lives did not belong to them, that the throne decided their future just as it decided the fate of the provinces. Ancient texts barely mention these daughters. Their names were lost, their stories left voiceless. But modern scholars, reading between the lines, discover the symbolic weight they held. They were the purest representation of the monarch's property. Born within the enclosure, they never knew any authority other than their fathers. They did not know what it meant to disobey. From a modern perspective, we might think they were victims of a system that transformed family ties into instruments of power. However, in the logic of the empire, everything had a justification. Religion legitimized the figure of the king as the incarnation of divinity. And under that idea, the boundaries between the sacred and the human blurred. What we see today as oppression was then perceived as destiny. The young women who grew up in that environment learned to read the symbols of power before the letters in books. Silence was their language. Their gestures were prayers that no one heard. And at night, when the lamps were extinguished, all that remained was the murmur of their thoughts, the secret desire for a sky beyond the marble ceiling. Some dreamed of escaping, but there was nowhere to flee. The palace was the entire world. The corridors were the paths of destiny, and the doors, the limits of the universe. In their dreams, the desert was freedom, the wind was a voice. But upon waking, reality returned with its smell of incense and its echo of distant footsteps. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that a man's character is his fate. In the case of these daughters, their fate was molded before they could even have a character. They were part of a structure that allowed no choice. They were born into the law of silence and were educated to perpetuate it. And so, generation after generation, the king's power was maintained not only by the sword, but also by the silent acceptance of those who never knew any other possible life. They were daughters of silence, involuntary guardians of a secret that history barely dared to name. And in each of them was reflected the paradox of the Persian Empire, a civilization capable of raising columns that touched the sky, but also of building walls so high that not even hope could scale them. In many ancient cultures, lineage was a sacred thread that had to be kept pure. Egypt, Babylon, And even some dynasties in India practiced unions between close relatives to maintain divine blood. In the mindset of antiquity, the purity of descent was a symbol of cosmic stability. If the gods did not mix their essence with mortals, why should a king? However, in the heart of the Persian palace, that logic was taken to a disturbing extreme, to a point where religion, power, and desire became completely intertwined. The oldest chronicles, especially those of Greek historians, mention a Persian custom called shwedoda, the marriage of the same seed. It was a practice intended to preserve the spiritual and political purity of the royal family. But what began as a symbolic idea, the union of the divine lineage with itself, transformed over time into an instrument of absolute control. The sacred became a justification for abuse. Herodotus, in his accounts, speaks with fascination and repulsion of the power of the Achaemenid kings. He describes how Xerxes inherited not only an empire, but an ideology, the belief that his blood was different, superior, almost immortal. If the monarch represented the god Ahura Mazda on earth, then his children were not simple descendants, but extensions of the divine. And in that spiritual distortion was born the seed of the forbidden unions, those that crossed the boundaries of kinship and morality. In the depths of the harem, where common law did not reach, it was said that the king made decisions that not even the priests dared to question. The eunuchs executed orders without raising their eyes, the women obeyed without uttering a word. No one spoke, because to speak was to deny the divinity of power. Thus the taboo of lineage, the most universal of all human limits, vanished before the will of the sovereign. But the matter is more complex than a simple act of moral corruption. What occurred within Xerxes' harem reflects a pathology of power that spans centuries. In any system where an individual concentrates absolute authority, where criticism is considered blasphemy and fear replaces reason, natural limits erode. What one generation considers unthinkable, the next assumes as custom. Greek texts recount that Xerxes, blinded by isolation, confused love with possession. He believed that everything born within the palace belonged to him. That logic of total ownership is the heart of despotism. The ruler does not distinguish between his kingdom and his body, between the territory and its inhabitants. If the palace was an extension of his will, how could there be prohibitions within it? From our modern perspective, these stories may seem monstrous, but in their context, they functioned as extreme manifestations of a religious and political mindset in which the monarch placed himself above humanity. What we would call a crime today could then be considered a right. The throne was not a seat, it was an altar. The result was the creation of a space where morality ceased to be a compass. In the perfumed darkness of the harem, the echo of the king's footsteps became law. The guardians lowered their heads, the scribes remained silent, and the walls kept secrets that no chronicler dared to write directly. That is why the accounts that reach us are fragmentary, wrapped in symbols, laden with metaphors. The ancients spoke of rites of lineage purification, of sacred alliances within the royal circle. They were euphemisms for the unspeakable. Nevertheless, even amidst the silence, the rumor survived. The Greeks, enemies and observers of Persia, interpreted those rumors as proof of moral decay. But to reduce it all to scandal would be to oversimplify it. Behind the shadows of history lies a deeper truth. Limitless power tends to recreate itself, to defy nature, and to turn transgression into a sign of greatness. In Persian culture, fire was a symbol of purity, of divine presence. Perhaps Xerxes believed he could touch that fire without getting burned, that the flame of power would make him eternal. But fire, even the most sacred, does not distinguish between worshiper and victim. Whoever tries to possess it ends up consumed by its own glare. The young women born in the harem, destined to fulfill the whims of royal fate, were trapped in that contradiction. They were at once a symbol of purity and proof of profanation. No Persian text names them, no song remembers them. Only silence repeats their story, that silence which is more eloquent than 1,000 words. In that silence, in that absence of names, one can still hear the lesson that history insists on repeating. When power cloaks itself in the sacred to justify the impossible, humanity is diluted and faith becomes a chain. No man can hold a crown without paying an invisible price. For Xerxes, the price was isolation. The vaster his empire grew, the smaller his inner world became. Everyone knelt before him, but no one looked him in the eye. He was worshipped as a god, but he lived like a prisoner in his own temple. In that golden silence, his mind began to distort reality. What for anyone else would be a limit or morality, for him was merely a shadow. Modern psychologists, when studying the effects of absolute power, speak of a phenomenon called progressive moral disinhibition. When someone has the ability to satisfy any desire without consequence, the brain begins to erase the line between the permitted and the forbidden. In Xerxes' case, that line disappeared completely. Every order of his was carried out without objection, every impulse attended to with devotion. No one corrected him, no one contradicted him, and without friction, there is no way to maintain sanity. Imagine a man whom everyone calls Lord of the Earth, whom the priests present as chosen by heaven. His life passes surrounded by applause, praise, and prayers. Day after day, his surroundings repeat to him that his will is the measure of the universe. How could he then distinguish justice from whim? Where could he find a mirror that would reflect his true image? Xerxes was surrounded by mirrors, but they all distorted his reflection to make him appear larger. The throne was his trap. From it, he governed peoples, but he could not govern himself. In the loneliness of power, desire becomes a form of escape. Abundance becomes tedium, obedience, white noise. Thus, excesses are born, not out of necessity, but out of emptiness. Ancient accounts describe him as a man with a restless gaze, incapable of remaining still. Some days he organized endless banquets. Others he locked himself away for hours without speaking to anyone. Behind every grandiose gesture was a crack of melancholy. Absolute power produces a particular form of loneliness, the kind that is born when the other no longer exists. For Xerxes, all faces were reflections of his will, and when the entire world becomes an extension of the self, the human being dissolves into his own delirium. Modern psychology would call it pathological narcissism. The ancients would have called it divine possession. In both cases, the consequence is the same, the loss of empathy. Inside the palace, the king was an object of worship. No one dared to pronounce his name without honorific formulas. Even his breathing was celebrated as an omen. That excess of veneration led him to believe that he could mold reality just by desiring it. In rituals, when the fire burned before the altars of Ahura Mazda, Xerxes saw his own image reflected in the flames and believed that the entire universe breathed through him. But fire does not distinguish between the one who lights it and the one who burns. The monarch's megalomania grew along with his isolation. The silence of the advisors, the fear of the priests, and the servility of the courtiers were the perfect fertilizer for a mind that no longer knew doubt. Everything he desired seemed just, everything that pleased him sacred. Thus, the boundaries between the moral and the divine dissolved in a single act of power. The most tragic thing was not only what Xerxes did, but what he failed to see. He lost the ability to recognize the pain of others. In his mind, people became symbols: loyalty, betrayal, beauty, utility. He did not see individuals but functions, and in that reduction of the world to a series of roles hid the seed of his downfall. Deep down, Xerxes no longer ruled an empire. He ruled a mirror. Everything he did to reaffirm that he existed. But the more he tried, the emptier he felt. The feasts, the conquests, the secret rites of the harem, all responded to the same need: to feel something, even if it was fear or guilt. Psychologists would say he was looking for the limit to remember that he was still human. But the limit in his case no longer existed. The gods, the ancients say, punish men not when they destroy them, but when they let them believe they are immortal. Xerxes was a victim of that punishment. Locked between walls covered in gold, he gradually forgot that even gold tarnishes over time. Absolute power did not turn him into a god, but into an echo of himself. Brilliant on the outside, empty on the inside. No tyrant rules alone. Behind every gesture of greatness, there is an invisible network of hands holding up the stage. In Xerxes' court, that network was composed of eunuchs, advisors, scribes, and priests. Each fulfilled a precise function, like gears in a machine designed not to govern with justice, but to preserve the illusion of divine power. The eunuchs were the first circle of control. Deprived of inheritance and descendants, they were the most loyal guardians, not out of devotion, but out of necessity. Their lives depended on the monarch's satisfaction. They opened and closed the doors of the harem, transmitted orders, and organized rituals. But they were also the bearers of secrets. What they saw, what they heard, what they understood about the intimate workings of the palace remained buried in their closed mouths. In a society where a word could be a death sentence, silence was the highest form of survival. The second circle was formed by advisors and bureaucrats. They administered the empire, taxes, tributes, campaigns, decrees, but their power was only apparent. Before Xerxes, they bowed so deeply that their voices were lost to the floor. None of them dared to correct the king, not even when they saw him fall into excess or irrationality. They knew that a single misinterpreted word could erase entire generations of privilege. Loyalty was confused with fear. Higher up the pyramid, the priests added a sacred veneer to everything that happened. In the fire temples, they uttered prayers that presented the king's decisions as acts of divinity. Every gesture of his became a sign from the gods. Every mistake, an unquestionable mystery. In this way, religion served as a mirror to power, legitimizing its absolute dominion and granting it the appearance of eternity. When the monarch spoke, it was the voice of Ahura Mazda. And to question the monarch was, therefore, to blaspheme. Thus the perfect circle was built. Fear, faith, and silence sustaining the throne. The result was a society where no one took responsibility, because the king represented the will of all, and all represented the will of the king. Atrocities, injustices, and humiliations were not seen as personal decisions, but as expressions of the universal order. Morality dissolved into protocol. The scribes tasked with recording the glory of the empire were perhaps the most skillful accomplices. On their clay tablets and monumental inscriptions, they engraved Xerxes as the protector of the weak, restorer of order, and destroyer of chaos. There is not a single word about the rumors of the harem, nor about the tears of the anonymous women who lived behind the walls. Official history had no place for pain, only for magnificence. Every fresco, every relief in Persepolis showed the king with a bow in his hand, confronting evil, surrounded by soldiers and flowers. The image was impeccable, like a sculpted prayer. But that perfection was the visible face of a carefully maintained lie. The artist knew what they could paint and what had to remain in the shadows. The art of power does not seek truth, it seeks immortality. The palace functioned as a continuous theater. Every person, from the servant to the noble, played a role. The script was simple: worship, obey, keep quiet. And in that collective silence, the monarch found the confirmation of his divinity. There was no possible contradiction. Even punishments, when they came, were presented as purifications of order. Cruelty was ritualized. Fear was cloaked in ceremony. The system was so perfect that even the oppressed ended up defending it. The women of the harem, educated in obedience, reproduced the very rules that oppressed them. The eunuchs, fearful of losing their position, watched and punished others to protect their own security. Thus, tyranny perpetuated itself without the need for whips or chains. Custom was enough. In the distance, the conquered peoples saw the great king as a distant god, a son that saw everything and forgave nothing. In the temples, his name was pronounced with reverence. In the markets, merchants offered prayers for his health. Imperial propaganda had achieved the impossible, transforming fear into devotion. However, beneath that appearance of perfect order, the building was beginning to crack. Some scribes on hidden tablets left small marks, ambiguous phrases, symbols that escaped censorship. It was their way of saying that they knew, that they had seen what the marble kept silent. Those fragments, rescued centuries later, are all that remains of human testimony within the divine mechanism. And while the machinery kept turning, the king continued to believe that silence was obedience. that immobility was faith. He did not understand that, in reality, his kingdom was rusting from within, that the gold of power was turning to ash. No one told him, because no one could. In Xerxes' court, the truth did not die with a scream. It died with a sigh. When the Greeks wrote about Xerxes, they did not do so merely to record history, but also to define the enemy. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, was actually the first great narrator of the conflict between liberty and despotism. In his pages, the Persian Empire becomes the reverse of the Hellenic world. Where Greece had citizens, Persia had subjects. Where Athens celebrated debate, Susa practiced silence. But between those lines laden with national pride, flashes of truth hide about what was happening behind the walls of the great king's palace. Herodotus spoke of Xerxes as a brilliant and fearsome man, capable of destroying cities with the same ease with which others knock down sandcastles. But his account is not neutral. The Persian is the other, the barbarian who lets himself be guided by uncontrollable passions, the monarch who confuses desire with right. And yet, by exaggerating his flaws, the Greeks also left us the silhouette of a possible reality, a power so immense that it had lost touch with humanity. Babylonian and Persian sources, for their part, are more discreet. Their official inscriptions, written in stone, do not mention a single blemish on the king's reputation. There, Xerxes is the guardian of order, the destroyer of demons, the protector of truth. The dissonance between both portraits reveals something essential. History is not a mirror, but a broken mosaic. Each fragment reflects a different angle, and only by gathering them all does the complete figure appear. In the Greek version, Xerxes' harem is an allegory of Eastern decadence, a space where abundance turns into corruption. In the Persian version, the harem barely exists, erased for political convenience. The two extremes meet. Exaggeration and silence produce the same effect. In both cases, the truth disappears. Modern historians attempt to navigate these murky waters. Some argue that many of the accusations against Xerxes stem from war propaganda. Greece needed to justify its resistance against an enemy that seemed invincible. Turning him into a moral monster was a way to make the victory seem more than military, a spiritual victory. In contrast, Persian scribes needed a perfect king, a symbol of stability in a world of intrigue. Between myth and propaganda, the real man blurs. However, something survives at the intersection of the accounts. The idea of absolute power as a disease of the soul. Herodotus, perhaps unintentionally, understood that the true horror lay not in Xerxes' excesses, but in his isolation. When the Greek chronicler describes how the king wept upon contemplating his army, hundreds of thousands of men who would die for him, he reveals a crack of humanity. For an instant, Xerxes understood the fragility of existence, and then he forgot it. That oscillation between awareness and denial is the essence of his tragedy. In later centuries, other authors took up his figure. In biblical texts, Xerxes appears as Ahasuerus, the husband of Esther. There, his image changes completely. He is no longer the Eastern despot, but an impressionable man capable of mercy. This version, although more benevolent, retains the same background, a power that depends on whispers, a heart molded by palace intrigues. Whether demonized or softened, Xerxes never recovers his full humanity. He is a symbol rather than a person. The task of the contemporary historian is to read between the lines, recognize biases, and understand that the victor's account is not the truth, but its shadow. And yet in that shadow, one can glimpse something that transcends time, the repetition of a pattern. Every time a society concentrates power in one figure, history begins to spiral toward the same destiny. Loneliness, excess, blindness. Perhaps that is why we continue to talk about Xerxes. Not because we want to judge him, but because, in his distorted reflection, we recognize our own risks. Herodotus presented him as a warning to the Greeks. We can read him as a warning to the modern world. Propaganda changes its language, but the mechanism remains. Courts transform into offices, eunuchs into advisors, temples into institutions, and yet silence remains the most useful currency of power. In the margins of ancient tablets, Some copyists wrote phrases that censors could not erase. One of them read, "The man who does not listen becomes his own enemy." Perhaps it was written with Xerxes in mind, or perhaps for all men who ever confuse the echo of their own voice with the voice of the gods. Because in the end, that is the most persistent lesson of Herodotus's mirror. No empire falls in a single blow. First silence collapses, then truth, and only then the walls. Behind the marbles and triumphal inscriptions, there existed a multitude of lives that left no written trace. They were the women of the harem, the mothers, the daughters, the servants, shadows moving in the twilight of a system that did not name them. For them, imperial splendor was not an experience of greatness, but of confinement. While the king ruled over provinces and armies, they ruled over silence. The harem was a paradox, a place of extreme luxury and absolute dispossession. Every jewel, every silk, every banquet was a mask to cover the deepest lack, the absence of choice. They lived surrounded by beauty, but without the right to look beyond the walls. Sometimes one of them would try to write or sing, but her words were lost before leaving the room. In official history, female emotions had no documentary value. Modern archaeologists, when studying the remains of the Palace of Susa, found small marks on the interior walls. Minimal engravings, almost invisible. Flowers, names, symbols. They were not royal decorations, but human gestures, small silent rebellions against oblivion. Perhaps they were made by the women of the harem themselves, or by the servants who saw them in secret. Those traces are the closest thing we have to their voices. Imagine the life of one of them. She is born within the compound, grows up watching her mother and aunts obey the rituals of power. She learns that smiling can be a way to survive. She learns that the wrong look can erase her existence. She does not know the open air, nor the sound of the market, nor the smell of the sea. She only knows the marble corridors and the murmur of perfumes. In that reduced world, the mind seeks comfort wherever it can, in music, in memory, in faith. Some of those women came from conquered lands, foreign princesses who were offered as political tribute, now turned into symbols of the empire's victory. They brought with them languages, songs, and beliefs that gradually faded away. Sometimes at night they whispered prayers in their native tongue, as a way of remembering that they had been someone before becoming the king's property. It was their intimate resistance, a memory that power could not control. In the logic of the palace, suffering had no place. Scribes did not record tears. Priests did not offer prayers for the captives. Everything was summed up in the word order. But that order was built on an invisible tension, collective fear. Every woman knew that her safety depended on the whim of one man. Every servant knew that a misplaced word could cost him his life. That atmosphere of containment created a type of silent violence, more enduring than any blow. The Persian philosophy of Zoroastrianism taught that the universe was a constant struggle between light and darkness, between truth, Asha, and lies, the Durj. In that sense, Xerxes' palace was a reflection of that battle. On the surface, everything was harmony and splendor, but inside, lies reigned disguised as obedience. The women of the harem were the mute witnesses to that contradiction. They knew that evil could dress in gold and that sin could utter prayers. The trauma of those lives did not disappear with the king's death. It was transmitted silently like an underground current. Modern psychologists would speak of transgenerational memory, the pain that goes unspoken but continues to breathe in future generations. Perhaps that is why, when centuries later Persian poets sang of love and melancholy, their verses always carried a tone of loss and distance. Perhaps without knowing it, they were listening to the echo of those forgotten women. The silence of the harem was more than a control strategy. It was an imposed language. And yet in their stillness, the women developed a form of wisdom. They learned to read the human soul through minimal gestures. They learned that power fears love, because love cannot be commanded. And that understanding, although born of pain, made them more lucid than their masters. On the palace walls, paintings showed gardens, eternally blooming flowers, trees that never lost their leaves. But outside that perfect painting, real life withered without a sound. No one wrote their names, but their absence weighs on history like a persistent shadow. The greatness of an empire is measured, the wise say, not by its conquests, but by the number of voices it silenced. Today, when we visit the ruins of Persepolis and walk among the columns that still stand against time, we feel that something is watching us. It is not the kings or the gods carved in stone. It is them, the forgotten ones. Their silence is not empty. It is a reminder. They tell us without words, we were here, and everything that power believed to be eternal turned to dust. When Xerxes fell, it was not because of a battle, but a silent conspiracy. He died in his own palace, betrayed by those who had served him most closely. It was a death without epic, without glory, without faithful witnesses. Thus end empires built on fear, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Later chroniclers barely dedicated a few lines to his end. The King of Kings was replaced by another name, another face, another throne. But the void he left was not political, but spiritual. The Persian Empire survived for a while longer, but something had broken at its core. Outer greatness could no longer hide internal decay. Provinces began to rebel, tributes were delayed, temples murmured. The sacred fire kept burning, but its light no longer inspired faith, only resignation. The people obeyed, but without believing, and that is the beginning of the end of all tyranny, when fear ceases to be reverence and becomes routine. Xerxes' legacy is not measured only in conquests or monuments, but in the warning his history represents. His reign is a mirror where every era can see itself reflected. Absolute power does not need swords or thrones to be reborn. The indifference of those who stay silent, the comfort of those who prefer not to see, is enough. The harem may change shape. No longer marble walls, but offices, institutions, screens. But the logic remains the same. Whoever concentrates the voice controls the truth. Modern philosophers say that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. In the story of Xerxes, evil took the form of obedience. It was not his enemies who sustained his power, but those who feared and venerated him at the same time. Everyday complicity, administrative silence, the habit of looking the other way, that fueled his despotism more than armies. And yet, amidst so much darkness, a spark of hope still shines. Because every time someone rescues forgotten voices, the nameless women, the faceless servants, the anonymous chroniclers, the cycle of silence is broken a little. Memory is the antidote to absolute power. To remember is not just to look back, it is to prevent history from repeating itself disguised as modernity. Walking through the ruins of Persepolis, one feels the weight of time, but also a strange peace. The columns, eroded by centuries of wind and sand, still stand as mute witnesses. And that is where Xerxes' lesson becomes universal. No power, however vast, can escape the judgment of time. Stone wears away, gold fades, names are forgotten, but the awareness of what they mean, the warning against abuse, blind faith, dehumanization, remains. In our time, the gleam has changed shape. It is no longer crowns or palaces, but numbers, screens, images. But the temptation is the same, to think that whoever has power can mold reality to their whim. Xerxes' history reminds us that all power isolated from criticism becomes corrupted, that all greatness without humility ends up devouring itself. The fire of Zoroastrianism, that symbol of purity, can still serve us as a metaphor. Keeping it lit does not mean worshiping the ancient gods, but guarding the inner light that separates truth from lies, justice from fear. When memory fades, power returns to darkness. But as long as someone remembers, as long as someone names the invisible victims, the fire does not die. Xerxes wanted to be eternal. In a way, he succeeded, but not as he imagined. Not for his glory, but for his warning. His life is a parable about the limits of human greatness, about the price of isolation, about the echo of silence. Every time a ruler surrounds himself with sycophants, every time a people renounces its voice, every time a woman is turned into an object of power, the specter of Xerxes rises again among the ruins. And yet there is also redemption, because history does not only condemn, it teaches. If the past was a golden prison, the future can be a temple of clarity. It is up to us to listen to the shadows and turn them into words. At the end of the tale, the columns of Persepolis seem to breathe. The desert wind passes between them like an ownerless prayer. In that ancient sound, one can still hear a message that crosses the centuries. Remember, because to forget is to rebuild the throne of silence.